reviewing what a rational versus an irrational number is. So a rational number is any number that can be written as a ratio. Remember, a ratio most commonly would be like a fraction. That is considered a ratio. So any number that can be written as a fraction is considered a rational number. So for example, all whole numbers, for example, 5, can be written also as a fraction by writing it over 1. So all whole numbers, also known as natural numbers, can be written as ratios. Also integers. Integers are going to be those natural numbers or those whole numbers and their opposites. So -1 could be written out as -1 over 1. That can be written as a ratio. Also, other rational numbers will include any fractions, which we already discussed, and any decimals. So in order for a decimal to be considered rational, it either has to terminate, like this one does. It ends after the 5, or it has to be a repeating number. So like here we have 0.3 repeating, but even if we had something like this, and it showed all 3 of those repeating, then that is considered a rational number. Irrational numbers, on the other hand, are going to be what I would call those crazy numbers. If I asked you to memorize those, you would say you're crazy. Those are numbers that never end. They're non-terminating. Okay, so some examples of irrational numbers would be pi. Now we use 3.14 for pi, but that's just a rounded number. Pi is actually a non-terminating number that continues forever. Also, non-perfect squares are going to be irrational numbers if they cannot be broken down any further. Now, if you had 0.6 underneath, 0.36 underneath, well, we can find the square root of 0.36, which would be 0.6. But if you have non-perfect squares that can't be broken down to a decimal number that terminates, then those are also considered irrational. Okay, the square root of any whole number that is not perfect, a perfect square, is irrational. And we already discussed that, like 2. Also, the decimal form of an irrational number neither terminates nor repeats. So those decimal forms of irrational numbers are those ones that I said to you earlier, continue forever. So pi continues forever. Oops. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and practice identifying whether a number would be considered rational or irrational. So the square root of 12, if you were to check that on your calculator, first of all, it's a whole number underneath of there that is not a perfect square. So that would be considered irrational. If we were to actually check to see what that number looks like, it's actually 3.464101615, and that's all my calculator actually shows. So that number would continue forever. So non-perfect whole number squares would be considered irrational. And that's why, because 12 is not a perfect square. Okay, so the next one, we have -0.364 with the 4 repeating. So the 4 is repeating. That would be considered rational. If I were to ask you to memorize that number, you could say, yeah, I could do that. I would just have to remember to continue to say 4 over and over and over again. Okay, our reasoning is because it's a repeating number or a repeating decimal. Okay, the next one, we've got 1 3/7. So we have a mixed number. Remember, any number that can be written out as a fraction, which is a ratio, is considered rational. So this would be considered a rational number, and that's because it is written as a mixed number. It falls between, or it can be written out as an improper fraction of -10/7. Okay, so why don't you go ahead, or we'll do this next one together, and then I'll pull another one out. So 0.85, it terminates, it ends. That would be considered rational. Why? Because it's a terminating number or a number that ends. It could also be written out as 17/20, which is the ratio form of 0.85. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and have you guys try these 3. So it says, tell whether the number is rational or irrational and explain why you chose that. So go ahead and pause your video on your whiteboard, write 1, 2, and 3, and then identify whether you think these are rational or irrational, and you can just use R for rational and I for irrational, and then check back on your video when you're finished. Okay, so here we got for number 1, we had an irrational number. And one thing I forgot to go over earlier is anytime you have these 3 dots, that means that that number is going to continue forever. Not as a repeating number, but it's going to continue to go on forever. So those 3 dots mean a non-terminating number. Number 2, the square root of 196 is 14, so that would have been a negative 14. So we did get a rational number there. And number 3, 2 as a whole number is not a perfect square, so that is also considered irrational. Okay, rational are numbers we can write as ratios, fractions in other words, perfect squares, and then any decimal number that either repeats or terminates is a rational number. Irrational are those crazy numbers, those numbers that never end. Those would include pi and non-perfect whole number squares.